Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
You're sort of immersed in it every day. You sometimes can't see the wood for the trees, so to speak. I actually understand what that figure of speech means, actually, for possibly the first time in my life. But then, of course, when the finish line is in sight, you do manage to rise above the fray, particularly if you don't have much skin in the game, or actually that's the wrong figure of speech. If you don't have a dedicated dog in the race, then you can rise above the fray and marvel anew at the absolute state of it. It's quite incredible, isn't it? How many people are casting their vote tomorrow based upon who they find least unpleasant or least frightening in the context of party leaders, as opposed to 2020 hindsight, but I don't think it's rose-tinted, as opposed to all those elections where you got to vote for someone who actually excited you. If you were going to do a sort of brief analysis of it, I encounter, and I think my sort of sample is fairly accurate. I still encounter a lot more people who are passionate about Jeremy Corbyn and what they think he represents than are genuinely passionate about Boris Johnson. But people are passionate about Brexit, of course, and Boris Johnson has successfully cast himself as the custodian of Brexit. He's forgotten completely, of course, that he wrote 2 columns the day before the referendum, one explaining why we should remain in the European Union, which had always been his position, and one explaining why we should leave, which had, of course, arguably only become an issue in this country as a result of the sort of stories that were published under his byline in the Daily Telegraph, and which turned out subsequently not to be true. But I don't encounter many what you would call passionate Boris Johnson fans in the same way that passionate Jeremy Corbyn fans genuinely believe he can effect profound change, positive change to the country, redress inequality, fix things like homelessness. I don't know. Just mention that because it's odd. It's so strange that those of us who don't really have a scarf around our neck feel almost that we're being held hostage by people who can't get their scarves off their necks. So complete is their dedication to the cause. I suppose I'm just expressing a degree of confusion about whether or not anybody actually believes in anything anymore, as opposed to just desperately hopes that things will turn out a certain way. 6 minutes after 10 is the time. There's a general election tomorrow. My apologies if you've missed that, and it's just come as a major shock. Poor old Keith looks like he's just been slapped around the face with a wet fish. But there is a general election tomorrow, and it is possibly the most remarkable in living memory. Whether or not it's the most important, well, it clearly is if you see it as the last gasp of the Brexit referendum, desperate to avoid any form of second referendum, people who were happy with the first result. You'd have to ask yourself why that would be. If things had gone well, then one presumes a second referendum would deliver a bigger victory for Leave than the first one did. The 52-48 would be dwarfed by the scale of people who've now actually had a look over the precipice and decided that what they can see really is sunlit uplands. We really can have our cake and eat it. They really do need us more than we need them. We really will be able to retain all the benefits of single market membership without any of the responsibilities, all of the promises that were made back in 2016. Imagine if they turned out to be half true. I don't even think we'd be having this election, would we? But there we go. The desperation with which some people have to pretend that the balloon hasn't burst and that we're not now being encouraged to vote for a shriveled, rubbery mess that was once a magnificent, shiny balloon is a conversation for the historians, I think, of the future. Is there a massive difference between what you want to happen and what you think will happen? And I don't just mean tomorrow. I mean looking down the rail tracks of British politics for the foreseeable. I haven't got a Scooby-Doo. I can tell you what worries me. What worries me is the rise of these interesting people who are associated with various lobby groups and think tanks, and who appear to me to have infiltrated the very highest levels of politics. I saw the footage today of a man in Boris Johnson's team swearing at a Good Morning Britain reporter who had the audacity to suggest that the Prime Minister might want to talk to the presenters of Good Morning Britain. And I didn't really heard of the fella before. Quick Google. Yep, there he is. Used to work for the Taxpayers Alliance. It is almost as if the warnings and the predictions that some of us have been making over the last few years have come completely true, and everybody else is pretending not to notice. So, what's going on? 0345 60 60 973 is the number that you need to just ideally... I don't even know who I'm most interested in hearing from today. I normally have an idea that people with changeable minds are the most interesting people, and normally I think we are. But on the morning before an election, people with changeable minds, I don't know. I mean, what are you expecting to happen in the next 24 hours that might influence your vote? So here's what we're going to do, okay? And it might be one of those mornings where we don't have to have any scraps or set twos, or it might be one of those mornings where we end up with so much blood on the studio carpet that you're going to have to wear flippers. Sheila Fogarty's going to have to wear flippers when she comes in later today. But what are you voting for? Not who, but what? And I wonder genuinely whether or not we would be able to tell who you were voting for from you telling us what you were voting for, especially if you removed the B word from the equation. And listen, I know that I've achieved some sort of curious status among people who want to stay in the European Union, but hand on heart now, I wish there'd been some good stuff emerged. I wish we'd actually had a few tangible benefits, a few actual improvements on our lives that were both plausible and endorsed by the available evidence, so that we could say, well, if it goes ahead, it's not going to be quite as bad as some of us feared, is it? But you've noticed, of course, that at some point in the last 3.5 years, we went from being told by Boris Johnson that we had to vote for Brexit because it was so brilliant, to being told by Boris Johnson that we have to vote for him to make the flipping thing stop because it's become so unutterably awful. Jeremy Corbyn, by contrast, I still don't know what he thinks about the European Union. They're both the same as each other. It's just that Boris Johnson will happily speak for both sides, depending on political pragmatism, and Jeremy Corbyn is continuing to refuse to speak to either side, I think, oddly, because of political pragmatism. If you had to bet your life on it, or your bottom dollar, who is the biggest Eurosceptic, Jeremy Corbyn or Boris Johnson? You see what I mean now? About what a mess everything is? Who's the biggest Eurosceptic? The man whose party offer those who want to stay in the European Union their last chance of getting that result? Or the man that wrote for many, many years about how important it was to stay in the flawed and imperfect but profoundly valuable institution that's called the European Union? Just think about that. If you think I didn't quite understand where I was coming from at the top of the show this morning, who is the most sincere Eurosceptic? Boris Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn? And then you see perhaps the seeds of the current confusion. I'm also drawn this morning. I'm hoping a question will appear in my mind before we reach 10:15, so that I can invite you to ring in. But I'm also interested in knowing what you think. How important are the newspapers? Because the figure, is it 85% of the adverts found on Facebook to have been put there by one party were untrue, were dishonest? I'll double check on that statistic before I tell you which party. But last time round, the argument was that during PERDA, when broadcasters are required by law to pay equal attention to all sides, that somehow created a landscape that allowed the Labour Party to surge. As a broadcaster, I didn't recognise the reality of that description, and as a voter, I certainly didn't recognise the phenomenon of people being turned on to Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party during the last election campaign, as opposed to people essentially voting for the Labour Party despite its leader. I think that happened to the Tory party as well last time around. It was very hard to find anyone who would describe themselves as a Theresa May fan, in the same way that you can find Boris Johnson fans. It's just because when you ask them what it is they believe in, that the picture changes somewhat. 13 minutes after 10. But look at this. Don't trust Marxist Labour. Boris ticks all the boxes, says Rupert Murdoch's son. Britain's future down to the wire. Don't sleepwalk into catastrophe, says Viscount Rothermere's Daily Mail. Tory lead narrows ahead of final election rally, says The Times, which again is the closest I think that we can get to objectivity. And then the Daily Boris graph. PM pledges to get tough on serious criminals. Of course, many experts in the legal world suggest that the best way to reduce criminality is to increase spending on the justice system. But hey, we're here. Can I get away with asking you what's going on? 0345 60 60 973. What's this general election campaign done to you? Well, where are you compared to where you were at the beginning of it? And I'm not that necessarily interested in your voting intentions. I'm not going to tell you mine. But I am interested in what it's done. The relationship between voter and politician seems to me to be very, very, very fragile at the moment. My personal, passionately held opinion is that the failure properly to challenge lies and liars has created a potentially catastrophic scenario, and my personal opinion is that is, as I've explained to you at length many, many, many times for many years now, a direct result of the Brexit referendum. When cheats prosper and when liars triumph, they very, very rarely rest on their laurels. They generally tend to pick up the same tactics and go after a new goal, a new target. But that's just me. You might see things very differently. You might still think you weren't lied to. That'd be an interesting explanation. So, give me a call. Say something clever. 0345 60 60 973. What has it done to you, this election campaign? And if you're not already aware, and I will at some point today explain, we can't talk about politics tomorrow. So this is our last chance before we have a Prime Minister, a new Prime Minister. It might be the old Prime Minister, but he'd be a new Prime Minister in the sense that he'd be newly installed in Downing Street. So it'll be Friday before we can talk about politics again. Talk to me about what this election campaign has done to you. It's 10:16. I haven't fully marshalled my own thoughts yet. I've got to do a couple of thousand words for the Times Literary Supplement over the weekend, but of course that is contingent upon what the result is. And you're bored to your back teeth of hearing people on the telly or the radio say how confusing it all is and how strange and how different. Something quite ugly seems to be on the rise, but again, it could perhaps go into retreat as a result of whatever happens tomorrow. We shall see. I want you to tell me what this election has done to or for you. And we'll start in Peterborough, whence Gareth has called. Gareth, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. How are you?
Very well, thank you. What's it done to you, this campaign?
I think it's turned me into someone I can't even recognise anymore. I'm a very placid person, but I found myself being on edge constantly, sort of judging people, thinking, I know you're that kind of voter, and judging them.
Is there anything? I'm very interested in this, but the phone line is not ideal. I'm just going to see if we can slightly tweak anything there and improve the quality of the calls. And I am definitely coming back to you. But let's head over to Kent in the meanwhile. Joe is in Sevenoaks. Joe, what's it done to you, this campaign?
Hello, James.
Hello.
I'm a first-time caller.
You're very welcome.
I've listened to you for quite a long time. I listen to all your sort of videos. I have to catch up on YouTube, I must admit. But
thank you.
This is the first general election that I think that I've been galvanised to actually go out and not listen to everything that I see on the telly or here in the media. I've actually gone out, done the research, and I must admit it is shocking when you see the day before the vote that people are going to go out and do tomorrow, that you see that one party, I think I'm pretty sure we all know it's the Conservatives, that 98% of their public adverts have been proven to be lies.
I had 85% on
I'm pretty sure I read this morning that it was slightly higher. I'm thinking it was definitely 98, something like that.
Well, we shall triple check that, but I mean, to be honest, if it was 85, I'm not sure the force of your point would diminish in any way, Joe, would it? It's still a fairly hefty figure.
No, but what I've noticed James. I mean, I've taken part in quite a few debates online.
Have you?
Which probably I shouldn't have.
Well, it's difficult.
I've got a point of view that I think, I lean towards common sense. I'm a Labour supporter myself, but have you always been a Labour supporter? Well, since I was old enough to vote, I took a view that I would make up my own opinion. My family are a Conservative family.
Yeah.
Some members in my family are Brexit. Some aren't. Some are Conservative.
Like all families.
Some are Labour.
Yes.
Yeah. But I've made my own mind up of what I believe in, and I'm a socialist at heart, James. I'm sure you can sympathise with that. But
do you know, that's one of the most, for me, what this campaign has done, and I know you didn't ask, but let me, you know how hard I find it to stay quiet for long, Joe. That word there is actually at the heart of everything for me, because it's a dirty word for so many people, and yet when I look at the NHS and the welfare state, I don't really understand how people have been... Do you, what do your mates think when you're having your debates? When you say socialism, you might as well say Stalinism to some people.
Exactly. You get called a Marxist, you get called a communist, but what I like to point out to people is that when Anya and Bevan first put the idea across of a free national healthcare service rule, it was laughed out of Parliament.
But yes, equally there was a Conservative health secretary during the war who spoke of a national health service in positive terms. So again, the danger of tribalism is not new. Specifically this campaign, I appreciate, I guess what, we were both wrong. You said 98, I said 85. The correct figure is 88% of Conservative ads in the run-up to this election have been found to be misleading compared to, this is from Full Fact, 0% for Labour. So, I mean, that is, for me, that's the terrifying thing, and I don't care. You can swap the two parties around. If the party that wins is the party that has been found to have disseminated deceptions and deceits on a massive scale, then, well, we haven't made any progress at all since the referendum result. And that I don't know what happens next.
I have made one sort of stark
go on.
I had to. If you ask, if the people that I've asked who are voting Conservative, that but I'm not sure if they've done the amount of research they probably need to do into it. If you ask them, why are you voting for Boris? Why are you voting Conservative? A lot of the time, they'll come at you with a negative opinion of Labour or a negative opinion of Corbyn. And you think, but you're voting for a party. You shouldn't be voting for an individual. You should be voting for the policies you think that will benefit this country.
You can also vote for damage limitation, can't you? You can also vote, and I suspect that's why the slogan "Get Brexit Done" has proved so effective and successful, because it allows people to swerve the question of other policy areas where they think lives might improve. Get Brexit Done just sort of trumps everything. But there'll be plenty of people voting the same way as you, but holding their nose about the leader. So I don't know that it's a uniquely Conservative position to be motivated more by negativity about the alternatives than positivity about your own man or woman.
Well, James, I think you and I are both well aware of the reality of Brexit. Boris said we'll be out by 2020, but in reality, we know that's going to be another 5 to 7 years of negotiations. He's got no trade deals. You can't. Where is it? Can you read the Brexit deal? Can we look at the oven-ready Brexit deal?
Well, these are rhetorical questions, of course, and this is what worries me, is it's great for business, as I've said quite a few times over the years. We'll have plenty to talk about, you'll have plenty to listen to, there'll be loads more of those clips popping up on your YouTube, but it doesn't actually feel as if any meaningful progress has been made at all. So this looks like, and it only looks like it at the moment, it looks like this is just another kicking the can down the road based upon promises that you can't see how they can be kept. And at this point in proceedings, I don't know how people would challenge you on that and say, yes, of course these promises can be kept. Here's lots of stuff that proves it. Because, of course, those arguments have been made before, several times. Joe, thank you, mate. Thank you for the kind words. 26 after 10. Back to Gareth in Peterborough. I was getting worried about you there, Gareth. You described yourself as a previously placid individual, but this election has flicked some switch inside you. Tell me more.
Yeah, it's really quite strange, because you don't realise how it is changing you until one day my wife turned around and said, I've never seen you so engrossed into politics as you are now. And I think it's purely down to how much I do use the NHS due to health reasons, and I think that's what gripped me into it. And I started looking at people like they're taking away something from me personally, which is quite strange to say, but it has turned me into a very bitter person, to which now I've just brought myself right away from politics, but then it drags me back in again because I can't help it, kind of thing. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I do. I think I'm a bit... Well, obviously it's my job, so I don't have the full luxury of contemplating ignoring the whole thing. But I got sent a book the other day telling... quite a clever book saying, stop reading the news and you'll be a lot happier. A very good friend of mine got so caught up in events in the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower tragedy that his doctor told him to stop listening to the news, to stop listening to the radio, and to stop watching the news, and he needed it for his mental health. That was more about coming to appreciating the bleakness of some of our fellow humans' outlooks on the world, rather than the political stage necessarily. Are there any glimmers of hope? What would constitute a good result for you in the coming days?
Well, it's been a sort of a roller coaster. I mean, I can't bring myself to vote for Boris because obviously of the lies and everything. And I'm trying. Well, obviously most of the papers are against Labour, aren't they? But I'm trying to see through the smears and the lies, and then I'm trying to see the truth. Whereas what I'm saying is kind of I've started to lean to one side, and then you look towards the other side like they're wrong on everything, even though they might have some right points, but you write them off before they even... it's a very, very... The anti-Semitism in the Labour Party is a very, very, very big obstacle for people to climb over. You're going to have to hold your nose very, very tightly, they tell me, in order to contemplate going that way. And of course, the 29 minutes after 10, thank you, Gareth. The one hope I had would be, and don't laugh, that things might calm down a bit. I don't think they're going to. The only question is whether or not we have a little bit more chaos, or whether we have a 5-year window in which people in power will be moving heaven and earth to try to avoid the continuing chaos. I can't see, this is quite an odd admission for me to make to you, but I'm inspired by my early callers. I can't currently see how, if you want to talk about normality or going back to the days when politics was about public spending and not much else, I can't see a way back there yet, whatever happens tomorrow. It's 10:30. One of the weirdest things about this election, I suppose what we should have done this morning is look for positives, sort of recognising that people who are enthused by neither Corbyn nor Johnson are at something of a loss as to what to do. Let me just triple check on that earlier conversation I had with a lad in Sevenoaks. It's 88% of Tory ads have been found to be misleading in the first few days of December. An investigation by First Draft, which is a non-profit organisation which works on debunking fake news, analysed every ad promoted by the UK's 3 main political parties on Facebook in the first 4 days of December, and it found that 88% of the Conservatives' Facebook campaigning pushed figures challenged by Full Fact, the UK's leading fact-checking organisation. By comparison, First Draft said that it could not find any misleading claims in ads run by Labour on Facebook over the same period. 88%. And you know, I thought we lived in a country where that would matter, regardless of who it was. It wouldn't be. I don't even need to look at my inbox to find or to be confident that there'll be people describing that as lefty propaganda. And that's the scary thing. When the independent voices, when the middle ground, when the genuinely objective describe facts or just describe research which appears to have been conducted in good faith, you don't like the result. You accuse the judges of bias. You see, I did occasionally wonder over the last few years whether or not those Daily Mail front pages were as significant and as profound as I thought they were back under Paul Dacre's editorship. But enemies of the people to describe judges, that is
I mean, at the time, we kicked off and we talked about it, but that is even a cursory reading of the history of totalitarian regimes will teach you that turning on the judges, turning on an independent judiciary is very, very, very rarely not a sign of worse things to come. And, you know, then you had the crush the saboteurs, the idea that politicians who seek to exercise their own judgment and act according to their own integrity are somehow in need of being crushed. Just think, those two headlines right there, enemies of the people and crush the saboteurs, seem to have set the tone for almost all that has followed. Because, of course, if the alternative to this toxic vocabulary is to admit, and it does all come back to this, just to admit that the Brexit you voted for is never going to happen, and you can't admit that, then you will lend your support to ever more dangerous denials, ever more dangerous ways in which to deny that simple fact. The Brexit you voted for is never going to happen. That's not your fault. But it isn't. When I predicted some months ago that Nigel Farage would eventually turn his fire upon Boris Johnson, I didn't expect it to happen in quite such a spectacular fashion, and I didn't know then when or where it would happen. But my goodness me, it was yet another one of those predictions that I rather wish hadn't come true. And, of course, all of the people who lampooned that prediction at the time are now pretending that this is what they wanted or this is what they knew would happen all along. Strange time. You'll remember the Coalition for Reform in Political Advertising joined us in the studio a couple of months ago. I think they were involved in the research that's looked into this figure of 88%, but it doesn't matter for two reasons. Number one, nobody thinks they've been manipulated by a dishonest post on their Facebook. Even yesterday, when we spoke to the editor of the newspaper responsible for the tale of the 4-year-old boy on the floor in A&E, and we reminded you that the hospital had apologised and acknowledged the veracity of every syllable of that story, you could hear that and still go away, if you were determined enough to, believing the things that weren't true. They even found the woman whose Facebook post apparently spawned the whole mess, and she claimed she'd been hacked. But no, some people are still absolutely adamant that it's true. On my local website, my local Chiswick residence website, some person had still, when I had a look at it this morning, still making the claim. But it was proven to be a lie, and that's the bit I don't get. I don't know how we turn that back. When I demonstrate to you that something is a lie, I still don't understand why you get cross with me. And that's why whatever happens tomorrow doesn't necessarily constitute a deliverance from the current chaos. I don't know. 10:37 is the time. Sarah is in Liverpool. Sarah, what would you like to say?
Hi.
Hello.
I just want to say that the press, it's really worried me how it's been. Like, I feel like the press, like specifically the Daily Mail, I would say, are the main guilty one. They've really...
Well, that's only because you're in Liverpool. You're in Liverpool, so you never see the sun.
Oh, definitely, yeah, well, I've heard. But you won't see the sun in Liverpool.
But exactly. But there's nothing new there. There's nothing new in newspapers offering up slavish support for the political...
I have never seen anger like this toward, like people have always had different political opinions. It's the way of the world. Obviously, yes. I'm left-wing. But the anger and hatred from both sides directed to each other, like even on social media. Yes. I mean, it's hideous. It scares me, the future of this country, when people are so angry at each other.
Well, I would struggle, and this upsets everybody, so strap yourself in. I would struggle to pick a winner on who is more toxic towards me personally, whether it is your racist Brexiter lobby or whether it is your hardcore Jeremy Corbyn fans. I used to play a game on Twitter where it would be hard right or Corbynite, and I'd put the words of the tweet up there, and you couldn't guess. The language was almost identical. The question people like you and me have to answer is how representative they are, how big those two groups are. I don't know. I know loads of people who will vote Labour who despise that wing of the party. I know loads of people who would have voted Conservative at the last general election, despite really not liking the racist Brexit wing of the party. Obviously, a lot of the MPs that they looked to have either been thrown out of the party or have left, but there'll still be loads of people voting while holding their nose. I just don't know how big the extremities are, Sarah. I don't know how we'd ever work it out.
The thing is, though, I think they're really big, because when you look, say, I'm just using social media, as an example.
Yes.
Like, no matter what fact, even towards Labour supporters,
yes.
If there is something that is come across that is not true, it's proved not true. You can put indisputable facts in front of the face, and it's like, no, that's not true, and they find a way to defend it. I do think that.
Why is that? Why is that, do you think?
I think it's tribal loyalties, and plus we're not so blind that those who won't see.
But what do they get in return? What do you get in return for deliberately? I keep lining up that Orwell quote.
People live off hope, and no one wants to admit that they could be wrong. No one wants to admit it's a human failing to not want to admit to making a mistake. And people live in hope that their personal beliefs or values will be upheld by, say, their vote, and any other way of thinking is just unthinkable.
Apart from Brexit, what beliefs does Boris Johnson represent?
Well, that's the problem. I mean, I know there's been a lot of problems with Jeremy Corbyn and anti-Semitism and stuff, and I do believe that has been a problem in the Labour Party. I'm not blind. To
me, that's an understatement. But I can tell you, and as you will know, I'm not a fan, but I know what his fans think he stands for. There you go. I don't know what Johnson's fans think he stands for, and I've asked hundreds of them over the last few months, 10 years.
That's the problem. You've asked most Tory supporters, what do you like about, the policies and, et cetera, et cetera. And from my own personal point of view, they come back with what they don't like about Labour.
Yeah,
and
well, and
I just don't know anyone who knows what Boris Johnson is about. Personally.
Well, he could have been asked this morning, of course, on Good Morning Britain, but he hid in a fridge. I don't know if you've seen that story, Sarah.
Well, I think at this point now, he's got a few hours left to the election, and he's taking the stance of saying nothing is better than potentially saying something that could, hit the headlines.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is, slipping people's phones into the pocket. And yesterday, of course, Jonathan Ashworth, Shadow Secretary of State for Health, recorded on a phone call to someone he thought was his friend, a Conservative activist he thought was his friend, and then the recording of him saying Jeremy Corbyn hasn't got a prayer finds its way into the media. So enormous embarrassments for the Labour Party as well. But I do wish I could find some way of objectively assessing the power of the press, because what really is, in an objective and honest universe, which of these two front pages would matter most to you? Boris ticks all the boxes, or Johnson saw my son's death not as a tragedy but as an opportunity. That, of course, an interview given by Dave Merritt, whose son Jack was stabbed to death in a terror attack last Friday. I don't know. Do you know what I'd like to do today? And I can, I suppose. Tell me something positive, but it's got to be something. Is it possible to say something positive about British politics that everybody would recognise as a positive? Because all I hear is, that'll teach Johnson, or that'll teach Corbyn, or down with you racist Brexiters, or down with you lefty do-gooders. Something positive. Was there ever a period in British political history where you could shake hands across the divide and acknowledge that the best man or woman won? There was. That's how we've spent most of our lives. But as I've said to you a bazillion times, Brexit has broken everything because liars and cheats won. And that is impossible to accommodate within a functioning democracy. And, of course, when you add to that the question of why the people who think leaving the European Union is a good idea are so desperately opposed to a second referendum, things get ever murkier. Speaking of a second referendum, one of the interesting elements of this campaign, for me, has been the interventions of people who are not paid to share their political opinions, whose careers do not depend upon amplification and pontification. Actors and footballers, Gary Neville on the football of the weekend, expressing views about racism and the toxicity of the national debate, ends up seeing people call for him to be fired as a football pundit on the telly, whereas you can be paid by the Barclay brothers to publish The Spectator and still apparently be an impartial politics presenter on British telly. A little mark there of just how mad things have perhaps become. But people who aren't paid by the Barclay brothers or Viscount Rothermere or Rupert Murdoch, people who aren't paid by anyone to offer up their political opinions, have taken it upon themselves, for reasons I don't fully understand, to stick their heads above the parapet. And I'm delighted to tell you we'll be talking to two of the most prominent today. You'll hear from Hugh Grant after this break, and you'll hear from Steve Coogan halfway through the next hour. A lot of people have sent me this. Basics of journalism in an authoritarian regime. Do not repeat propaganda. Do not give lies a platform. Do not give both sides as a legitimate argument that is then used against real journalism. We are better than this, my fellow journalists. That's a tweet from Maria Hinojosa, who is a prominent American journalist. And that line there, do not give both sides as a legitimate argument that is then used against real journalism. I'll show you what I mean. Those of us who don't like to see electorates being lied to, those of us who don't like to see the independence of the judiciary coming under attack from a national newspaper, those of us who don't like to see elected politicians of any stripe being described as saboteurs who must be crushed, those of us who don't like to see electoral law being broken, those of us who don't like to see 88% of adverts put on Facebook by a single political party being found to be misleading. It doesn't matter which the party is, but of course that line there, do not give both sides as a legitimate argument that is then used against real journalism. I just glance over to my inbox to show you, because I think it's important to give you live, living case studies of just how it works. And here you go. How can J.O.B. plead for positivity, the original doom-monger, without a good word for anyone? No irony when complaining about a climate you create. There's no division between people who hate lies and everybody else, all right? Unless you are claiming to love lies, in which case I haven't created a climate of division. I've just pointed it out. There is you over there asking politicians to lie to you. There is me sitting here saying politicians shouldn't lie to you. None of them, ever. But they do. And if you want to count up the lies or the liars, and you find that there's an epic imbalance at the moment from one party to the other, then the only way you can make sure that the epic imbalance isn't repeated at some point down the line, but the other way round, is to join me in hating deceptions and lies, you see? Because you cheer for your man as he lies to you. You create an environment in which the one you don't like can also lie. See? Simples. So join me on the side of the truth, instead of tweeting me from your weird bulldog avatar accounts, claiming that somehow being lied to is the delivery of your democratic benefit. Now, Hugh Grant was in the building earlier today. I've never met the man. I'm quite an admirer of him recently, particularly because I get paid to do this. So the jip that I receive, such as it is, and you know, 99.9% of it is pathetic stroke hilarious, but you know, occasionally you get stuff where you need to call the police and things like that. So it's my job, it's my vocation. I don't understand fully the people who do this for no reason whatsoever. In fact, arguably in ways that might damage their careers or damage their public popularity. I mean, I understand the obvious answer, which is principle and integrity, but I buttonholed Hugh Grant as he came out of the lift, dragged him into a studio and insisted that he answer my questions. And this is a recording of what happened. There is a case to be made for some unlikely characters to have moved into the space left by politicians who, or with whom, much of the public have fallen out of love. What I find interesting about the interventions by actors or footballers or sundry other people who aren't professional politicians is that there's nothing in it for them. And yet, by putting their head above the parapet, they invite astonishing amounts of criticism and abuse. Hugh Grant, you're fairly near the top of that list, I think, of people who have put their heads above the parapet. So the obvious question is, why? What's in it for you?
Well, I feel like a Coke can that's been rolling around the bottom of a car for too long, and you know, someone needs to pull the ring, and because I'm just angry. I'm just angry and worried. And I'm not normally like that. Not, a general election comes up, I take a moderate interest. And if, say, the Conservatives get in, I think, well, it wouldn't have been my choice, but at least, they'll be fiscally responsible or something like that. And this time round, I think it's a very, very different beast. I think now that they've kicked out their moderate, decent, responsible element, we're facing something very dark and very scary. And for the first time in my 59 years, I really am worried for the country. And I, as a dad and all that, I suppose that's what I am. I'm a militant centrist dad.
And it is the tactical voting banner under which you've marched most forcefully. Just explain to people still not clear on precisely what that means. What that means.
Well, it means that without any question, the Conservatives will win the election tomorrow unless people can suspend their tribalism, which is not, I'm not saying that in a pejorative, negative way. People, feel very strongly about the parties they've supported for years. But the Tories will win tomorrow if everyone just votes for the party that they've always adhered to and loved. If they could, in many, many, many constituencies in this country, if people could lend their vote tomorrow, who normally vote for a progressive non-Tory party, if they could lend their vote perhaps to the other progressive party, which is best placed right behind a Conservative, to topple that Conservative, then they won't get their majority and the country at least is temporarily saved. So you have to go to one of these tactical voting websites. The big three, Remain United, People's Vote, Best for Britain, have now amalgamated, finally, thank God, all giving exactly the same advice. And any of those three would be a great place for people to go to and have a chance to actually make a difference with their vote and take out a Tory.
Your concerns clearly are much wider than Brexit. I didn't realise that. I wondered whether you were simply one of those people who is very keen to slam the brakes on Brexit, but you speak of much broader concerns. Yeah,
it did begin with me with Brexit. And I speak as someone who was rather bewitched for a moment by some of the Brexit slogans 3 years ago, because like everyone else, I knew nothing about it. No one had any interest in our relationship with the EU 3 years ago. And I got interested and started reading about it. And it became clearer and clearer that this was just an awful idea, and that the slogans were lies, and that the EU, imperfect though it undoubtedly is, had been scapegoated, made the reason for people having pretty crap lives in this country, which they unquestionably do. And so I was originally angry about Brexit, but I have to say, since Boris Johnson took over the leadership of the Conservative Party, I've just got more and more worried and angry about what he and his henchmen, the sort of Dominic Cummings of this world, are getting up to. When they prorogue Parliament illegally, lie to the Queen, seem absolutely ready to effectively break up the United Kingdom, hiving off Northern Ireland. This is scary stuff. And I felt that, everyone really needs to stand up and say that, okay, no, this is not politics in the normal British way. This is something darker and bleaker, and it's got to stop. And yeah, I sense, I'm not going to get the scoop here. You haven't been tempted by your interventions in this election to consider a political career at any point in the future. Well, I was a bit. Really? But I find it impossible to cram my political instincts, such as they are, into one political box. I would never really be very good at taking orders and following the party line. And it's nice to have that flexibility where if I change my mind, I change my mind. So maybe, if I can be useful at all, I'm more useful just sort of campaigning rather than standing. So you don't see this as the end of the line necessarily then? Whatever happens tomorrow? Well, I don't, the way the parties are set up at the moment, if all moderate Labour people and the whole of the Lib Dem party and moderate Tories wanted to unite under a kind of rescue party banner, that appeals to me. Do you think? But I don't think that's going to happen. No. I should congratulate you on your absolutely virtuoso performance as Jeremy Thorpe. What do you think he'd make of the current political climate? Well, Jeremy Thorpe, interesting character. I mean, I know which side he'd be on our side, and he'd be right behind us, and he'd be making marvellous speeches. But there are parallels. When I researched him, I found that there are parallels between him and Boris Johnson. They're both old Etonians. And something that happens at Eton is that there's incredible competitiveness from the day you get there to the moment you leave. I say I haven't been to Eton, but I have friends who've been there and doing all this research. I learnt this stuff. They're encouraged from day one to be top of maths, top of classics, to get into their prefect gang, which is called POP there, where you get a coloured waistcoat. And then as soon as you're out of Eton, and then you want to be head boy. Then as soon as you're out of Eton and you go to Oxford or wherever, you want to be head of the Oxford Union and head of the Liberal Association of Students or whatever it might be, with really scary Machiavellian shenanigans to get there, backstabbing, And people spoke of Jeremy Thorpe that way in exactly the way they talk of Boris Johnson's past. It's something a little bit Etonian. It's ruthless. You trample your grandmother to get to the top spot.
Hugh Grant, thank you so much.
All right.
It's coming up to 11 o'clock. That was Hugh Grant talking to me earlier. There are, of course, public figures who are ploughing the opposite furrow, urging you to vote for Boris Johnson's Conservative Party. There always are. For example, Stephen Yaxley Lennon has recorded a short video message telling you to do so. You might know him better by his stage name, Tommy Robinson. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we continue to contemplate a really unprecedentedly bleak political landscape for many people. One understands, well, not necessarily agreeing with the enthusiasm that is felt by some voters, but equally the absence of enthusiasm that many voters feel for the leader they're poised to vote for. Well, that's, for me at least, a cause of deep concern. I'm sort of psychologically intrigued by the relationship between media and voter, but of course the voter isn't. The first discoveries I made when I started doing this job was that you're not interested in this business. And yet this business runs through British public life like Blackpool through a stick of the proverbial rock. So even people who say they're not interested in politics are, of course, interested in politics, but just not in the literal sense of the word. You're interested in schools, you're interested in hospitals, you're interested in whether the streetlights come on or whether the road's full of potholes. You're interested in all manner of issues, but you might not be interested in politics in terms of the toing and froing that often leaves us feeling quite dispirited in the aftermath of a raucous PMQs, or in terms of the sort of relatively pointless exercises in political debate that populate most of the television panel programmes now. Reaching the point, a slight exaggeration perhaps, but I think I could make a case for explaining why it's not. Reaching the point where you now have in British broadcasting a convention whereby you introduce someone who lies and then you introduce someone who points out the lies, and they are treated with equal balance and equal respect and authority. I'd trace it back to apolitical issues, or at least issues that are not party political in the first instance, and I'd point at climate change, and I'd point at the MMR vaccines, where you essentially have, in the case of climate change, over 90% of the world's scientific consensus on the one hand, then Nigel Lawson and some weird bloggers on the other hand, and you end up treating them with equal respect and authority. And that opens up a gaping chasm through which other peddlers of untruths and embellishments have galloped, culminating, of course, in that interview I always think of on during conversations like this, where I witnessed, I hosted a conversation between the former Director General of the World Trade Organization, Pascal Lamy, and the Conservative candidate, Andrea Leadsom. And he essentially, I had to, at the time as a BBC employee, I had to treat them equally in a conversation about the WTO, the former Director General of it. And a woman who at the time was famous for suggesting that we could dig our way out of any Brexit-related economic troubles by selling more artisan jam. And that was a moment for me. And here we still are, wondering how things have fallen so far so fast. It's easy, you know, that both sides. Many issues do not have both sides, or two sides. And if you really feel the need to give a voice to the 3% or the 5% of people that think the moon is made of cheese or that the earth is flat, then give them 3% or 5% of the available time. It's not difficult. And if someone comes on your programme and fibs to you, next time they come on, remind them of the fib. Show them the lie. Replay them the tape. This is fixable. But it's not fixable without public will, I don't think, without the will of the people. And the will of the people has become so corrupted over the last a few years, inevitably, because during the Brexit referendum, the cheats and liars won, everything becomes corrupted by that. And until we retrospectively admit it, or until we move so far away from it that we can almost turn the system off and turn it on again, I personally don't see how you're going to have a return to a semblance of normality, you know? 7 minutes after 11 is the time. How astonishing it should be for our media that a former Conservative Prime Minister, Sir John Major, can urge people not to give the current Conservative Prime Minister an overall majority in the House of Commons. I mean, that, again, it's tough. My ankles are tied together because of my perceived convictions and beliefs. But Brexit withstanding, I'm a bit of a pudding when it comes to my political beliefs. There's no party that feels like home for me. But that simple statement there, that should be one of the things. Again, is this the umpteenth time we've pointed out things that should really impact equally on all of us, regardless of how we stand or what we think politically. A former Conservative Prime Minister urging voters not to give a majority in the House of Commons to a current Conservative Prime Minister. Now, if you were to be policing the boundaries of impartiality, how do you police that? Imagine if you wanted to make a complaint about me being anti-Conservative because I'm talking up Sir John Major, a former Conservative Prime Minister. How does that work? How on earth does that work? Do you see what I mean about everything being broken? And you will also know, if you take a newspaper or if you cast an eye over the newsstands of a morning, you'll also know that most of my colleagues in this industry decided to give more coverage to a former Labour backbench MP called Ian Austin, urging people not to vote for Jeremy Corbyn, than they did to a former Conservative Prime Minister called Sir John Major and a former Conservative Deputy Prime Minister called Michael Heseltine, urging people not to give Boris Johnson an overall majority. You see, that's not bias. That is saying that if a Prime Minister from one party urges voters not to let the current leader of his own party be Prime Minister, that should just be massively newsworthy. It just should be, right? But it isn't. And then you just start looking at how many of the people occupying jobs in the current regime have their roots in some of those organisations funded by we know not who, but dedicated to reducing the tax burden on the wealthiest people in the country. That should be newsworthy as well. So let's have a look at the front pages of today's newspaper. Viscount Rothermere's Daily Mail. Britain's future down to the wire. Don't sleepwalk into catastrophe. You must use your vote and stop us plunging into the greatest crisis since the war. The Daily Mirror. Johnson saw my son's death, not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. That's a man who has buried his son. Rupert Murdoch's son. Boris ticks all the boxes. Don't trust Marxist Labour. The Barclay Brothers Daily Telegraph. PM pledges to get tough on serious criminals. And then a big picture of Boris Johnson driving a digger through a wall, driving a JCB through a wall. The owner of JCB, of course, a big donor to the Conservative Party and to Boris Johnson individually and to the Brexit campaign. But here is our Prime Minister driving a JCB digger through a wall with the word gridlock written on it during a visit to Staffordshire yesterday. Where do you go for balance? I don't know, to be honest with you, but the Times comes close most mornings. Tory lead narrows ahead of final election rallies. See how boring real news is? Tory lead narrows ahead of final election rallies. Oh, here's a Prime Minister driving a JCB through a pretend wall. That's the thing, I think, that depresses me the most, is the success with which people who treat the British public like a bunch of puddings can thrive. Is anyone going to look at that picture and go, yay? And if you look at that picture and go, yay, then in a logical universe, if Jeremy Corbyn were to drive a JCB through a pretend wall, you should also go, yay, because it's the driving the JCB through a pretend wall that you're supposed to be going yay about, not the tribal identity of the driver. Would it be beyond reasonable expectation to ask you to call me and say something positive? 0345 6060 973. Even I've given up asking people to say something positive about Brexit. Tell me something that's going to improve. Tell me something that's going to be better. Oh, don't be ridiculous. We've just got to get it done. Why? Because people want it. Yeah, but people wanted it because they were told it would make their lives better. And now you're not even pretending that that's true anymore. Yeah, but we've still got to do it, old boy. Why? Well, measure twice, cut once? Anybody? Juliet is in Basingstoke. Juliet, cheer me up.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm a first-time caller, so I'm a bit nervous.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Something positive. I got to be the next person you spoke to after Hugh Grant. That's as close to Hugh Grant as I'm going to get. There you go.
You never know. I might have thought that once. Live in hope. Live in hope, Juliet.
Always. I sound cheery, but actually, I'm really despondent about the way society is at the moment and the election campaign and everything since Brexit. I don't know how we've come to live in a society where we factor in unacceptable behaviour and where it washes over us so easily, or washes over people so easily. I spend a lot of time on social media trying to weed out the fake bits, trying to explain to people that what they're posting, doesn't have.
But I don't do that because it's my day job. But I did look at my local residents' website this morning, and one bloke had posted that lie about Leeds General, and then 100 people had replied to it pointing out the lie. But I don't know, and I'll never know, and we've got no way of knowing whether that bloke goes away reviewing his position on British politics or whether he just hunkers down further in the hunkers in the bunkers.
I think they do. I see a lot of people justifiably posting a lot of anti-Corbyn stuff about anti-Semitism on my timeline. And, a lot of it is justifiable. But put up a story about Boris Johnson. So, for example, the fridge story this morning, they will never counter that there's something wrong about him running away from being accountable and answering a few questions. He promised to do an interview, never did the interview, won't be accountable.
Yeah, he hid in a fridge this morning. I've looked at the footage, and there's a former Taxpayers Alliance person who is now an advisor to Boris Johnson is using the F word. He gets caught on camera using the F word. But even that, feels a little bit pantomimey now. So you've got a Prime Minister hiding in the fridge, a top aide swearing live on breakfast television, and, let's all just carry on as normal.
I saw it live this morning, and I was astonished. And I was just astonished that it can be that as the man that wants to be our Prime Minister, he thinks that's acceptable behaviour. It's not. In my book, it's not.
Well, it is, if people accept it. What's the definition of acceptable? Are people accepting it? Yes, well, therefore it's acceptable. So strange thinking, but
this is
fair.
This is not how we would act at home with our families and our friends, or maybe people do. So you need to speak to someone in your family. What, they keep hiding from you because they don't want to give you the right answer? Imagine not speaking to your mum or dad because you're too scared to tell them you broke a vase.
But
that's not how we act as normal people.
Of course.
So why, just because he's Prime Minister, should he act any differently? The other side of it is, if you start criticising it, you're accused of having bias instead of having an opinion.
Yes.
You're not allowed to have an opinion anymore. And if you do have an opinion, then you can be called anti-Semitic because, you're saying something about Corbyn that may be positive, but you're anti-Semitic because he's anti-Semitic, whereas you may not even agree with...
It's a tricky one, that, for a lot of people. I know my mate Dan Hodges has gone in very, very hard this morning on how a vote for Labour from people who think that the anti-Semitism, or people who understand that the anti-Semitism is a serious problem, that would represent some sort of mortal shift in British politics. My confusion on that is the either-or element, When you look at what people like Saeed Awasi, a former chairman of the Conservative Party, say about Islamophobia in the Conservative Party, I just see them equally. I don't understand how...
Absolutely.
One has become a massive, massive issue, and the other just gets swept under the carpet. I want to live in a country where they're both massive issues, where Muslims and Jews can both feel safe in the context of major British political parties. At the moment, they can't, and they don't. 60 minutes after 11. Another word, just for people who are interested in it, for students of the game. A few people getting in touch to suggest that because of Hugh Grant's well-documented arrest many years ago for consorting with a prostitute on Sunset Boulevard, that somehow people like me who find the moral depravity of Donald Trump or indeed of other politicians, there's something hypocritical in listening to an actor who once got caught with a prostitute if you disapprove of a president who's facing over 20 charges of sexual assault and rape. Again, I'd ask you this question. How have they managed to turn you into such a turnip? Give me a ring and tell me something cheerful. Go on. Cheer me up. Something that will please everybody. Not some ludicrously partisan and almost certainly untrue point, but reasons to be cheerful on 0345 6060 973. And again, that astonishing state of affairs whereby a huge number of people will be casting their votes yesterday according to who irritates them or worries them or frightens them or annoys them least, rather than who delights or excites or enthuses them the most. I wish you could make some sense of that for me. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. It's 20 past 11. Let's go to Hamza, who's in Tunbridge Wells. Hamza, what would you like to say?
Before I tell you something I think quite positive, yes. I will just make a rather embarrassing admission that this is the first year I'm actually voting.
Well, how old are you?
Well, I'm 24.
Okay. Well, you should have voted in 2017, but it's not. And you could have voted in 2015, but it's not necessarily embarrassing to admit that. What's changed, though?
Right.
What's changed?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's part of the positive thing I wanted to highlight is that, you know, in my university, and this is my 5th year of education because of how long my course is. It's the first time this year that so many of us are getting together for hours on end, debating politics, talking about issues that, you know, I would never thought I'd be talking about. And, you know...
Why? Why do you think that is? Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I think it's almost as if things have got so outrageous with the politics and the way that things are being, sort of facts are being claimed to be spread and sort of what's sort of circulating around the web and social media. And that's where we exist. We exist on Facebook and Instagram, and that's where all of this stuff is taking place, weirdly enough. And I think that's just caused a lot of young people to just start going, wait a minute, you know, I can have an effect on this.
Well, it's caused a lot of young undergraduates in Tunbridge Wells and its environs. No, I'm not being patronising. You know, we all suffer a little from our perspectives, don't we, from our bubbles, and I don't know that people of your age and ilk from very different backgrounds are feeling as politically engaged as you are.
Right. I mean, I go to uni in central London, so it's, you know, I think that might have, you know, I think I could confidently say that, you know, students in London are becoming more part of the political discussion and debate. You know, we all convene around, you know, a particular pub on a particular day, and, you know, these are big groups of students of us who are talking about politics for hours and hours.
Do you know, again, the weird thing here is when I was at university, the students who were obsessed with politics were almost exclusively prunes. They were the kind of people you'd cross the bar to avoid if you saw them coming towards you. And most of my generation recognised that. It's why it's perhaps slightly dispiriting that so many student politicians have ended up being grown-up politicians. One of the things I liked about David Cameron before the wheels came off was the fact that he never got involved in student politics. There's so much more you could be doing at that age. But this is a very different era, and it's a very different age. So what you're describing are not the usual kind of militants and Tory boys lining up to get involved in politics. It's people who are interested more perhaps in the issues than the parties?
Yeah,
I don't know.
It's a lot of neutrals as well, and I know this segment that you wanted to do today is more targeted at the neutrals, and I consider myself to be a neutral. A bit shocking to say that a day before election, but, you know, I think one of the reasons that plays into it as well is the fact that, you know, this sort of, you know, the Extinction Rebellion thing is quite a popular thing in universities, and they become quite a strong voice in sort of the student bodies. And then it causes, again, a lot more students to start to question, oh, where do I stand on this? But in terms of my actual position, I did one of those policy tests where it says on the internet you do vote for policy instead of person. And I got 40% Conservative, 40% Labour, and 20 Lib Dem. So my neutrality was even more sort of...
Do you know, I don't think there's anybody alive whose actual political interests would ally with what they think their political interests are if they went through one of those programs that you describe, one of those computer programs that you describe. It's incredible, isn't it? I'm not going to ask what you're going to do because I already know where you are, and I don't want to do any constituency-specific stuff. And while I take your point that the engagement of young people on a scale that you don't recognise is a positive, it kind of puts an awful lot of pressure on your generation, and I'm not sure we've got time to wait for you lot to reach your maturity and start seeking political office in order to undo some of the damage that is already underway. I mean, it's unfolding in front of us.
Yeah, well, I guess that does put us in a point where we...
This is the best phoning ever, this, Hamza. Give me a ring, say something cheerful, and I'll rain all over it.
Well, no, I mean, I have forced myself to sort of come to a position now, and weirdly enough, it's down to a very weird question I asked myself, slightly morbid as well, because it's quite weird to say this, but I'm becoming a father as well, so I'm soon to be a father.
Congratulations.
I asked myself, if I was to sort of leave a child in this world, or if I was to sort of pass away, who would I vote for? And weirdly enough, given I am neutral in a lot of these policies, I did end up saying it would be Labour, because when it comes to Labour, I felt, in terms of the social welfare, in terms of what they want to do on a large scale for people and their health, mental health, their sort of social positioning and social sort of not positioning, their sort of social welfare. I just felt that Labour leans way more towards a healthy society and country than sort of the Conservative policies, which I think
they're all claiming more or less the same thing, and they've both been criticised, I think, by the Institute of Fiscal Studies when it comes to the costings. It's more an emotion. Forgive me. It's more. I'm hearing more emotion than analysis, in that you're just, I think, taking a view on two people making similar promises and choosing or feeling that you can trust one of them and not the other, which is... I hope I'm not.
I think you're right. I think you're right.
Which is not ideal, really.
I think it comes down to the fact that the Tories have a track record that's a lot more. You can make a lot more.
Yes, but Boris Johnson's got nothing to do with the last 9 years of Tory rule. Haven't you been paying attention?
Yeah, but Johnson's been doing his own, he's had his own track record on the side, so it just adds to sort of the mistrust people feel towards Conservatives.
Possibly. Well, the mistrust you feel towards Conservatives, and while you're not alone, you certainly don't speak for everybody, either of your generation or otherwise. That's me being all grown up. Hamza, thank you, mate, and good luck with the imminent new arrival. It will indeed, as you already suspect, change absolutely everything. 27 minutes after 11 is the time. If you didn't understand why I asked Hugh Grant about putting his head above the parapet, if you thought, well, he's all right, what's he got to worry about? Have a look at some of the replies to the clip of me talking to him, and you'll just see exactly what I mean. Why would somebody like him, or Gary Neville, or Gary Lineker, or Steve Coogan, or Emma Thompson, people who don't get paid to do this, and people who arguably are going to be financially much better off under a Conservative government than any other, or they've got the financial wherewithal to move should Labour get in and they were worried about having to pay more taxes or stuff like that. I don't know why this narrative has taken hold. I've got theories, but people who are not professional commentators, who are not being paid by newspaper-owning billionaires to promote the politics of newspaper-owning billionaires, seem to have a massive problem with writers and actors and sports people expressing sincerely held political opinions. And that, actually, the more I think about it, the bigger problem that becomes. Who are you going to trust? Oh, I'm going to trust the person who's getting paid £250,000 a year by the Barclay brothers to write newspaper columns about why we should build the country in a way that the Barclay brothers really like and want. Yeah, definitely trust them. What about that fella over there who was dragged himself up by his bootstraps and made a ton of money because he's brilliant at football? Yeah, well, he should shut up and sit down. Just run me by that again. The person over there, the actor, who doesn't get paid by anybody to express his political opinions, you've got a problem with them. But the columnist who gets paid a ton of money to express political opinions that are miraculously aligned with the desires of the billionaire owners of their newspapers, they're the ones you can trust? Oh, OK, yeah, that makes sense. That no doubt is a recipe for happiness and security in the future. It's coming out to 11:30. Speaking of Steve Coogan, we'll be joined by him after the break. So, again, this notion of tactical voting, which I'm not going to lie to you, I don't fully understand, is one which merits a little bit of explanation. Of course, I should remind you that if you don't want to vote tactically, then it's really, really simple. You simply vote for whichever party you prefer, regardless of the electoral arithmetic in relevant constituencies. It's a bit like, I suppose, the well, no, you just vote normally, or you vote tactically, I think, is probably the easiest way of describing it. That's if I've understood it properly. It's 11:30. Reasons to be cheerful on 0345 6060 973, and I promise to try my very hardest not to rain on your parade. Let's go to Battersea. Guy is there. Guy, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. Pleasure to speak to you. I'm a first-time caller to the show, but I've been listening for years.
Thank you.
I wanted to say that it's ironic that for someone who's got little or no party political affiliation whatsoever, I've been galvanised by this general election like never before, because I think it's the fight of our lives, and I'm fighting for my kids' freedom of movement, among other things.
What's on the other side of the scales? Because people stopped ringing me about 18 months ago trying to tell me what the benefits of Brexit would be. I guess that's probably the pivotal point when we moved from being told we've got to vote for it because it's a brilliant idea to being told that we've got to vote for Boris Johnson to make the awful thing stop. But what do you hear when you say stuff like my children's freedom of movement? They say, yeah, but on the other hand...
immigration.
Is that still it?
I sort of gave up long ago trying to persuade Brexiteers, but the point I rang in about was that the kind of general, not just the lies and toxicity of the current general election campaign, but the general sort of toxicity of the public discourse since the referendum and all the revelations we found out about dark money and lies, etc., have really made me so angry that they've had a profoundly deleterious effect on both my physical and mental health. Gosh, really?
And you're not alone. I appreciate that's no comfort, but an awful lot of people are feeling an existential angst at seeing lies go unchallenged and unpunished, I think.
Absolutely. And on the physical side, I got sort of something approaching an ulcer, so I have to take medication, and I'm not allowed to eat curries anymore.
Oh, that's just cruel. That's brutal, man. Seriously. I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy.
And I bet, if I asked my doctor, he would probably give me the similar advice that your friend received, which is to stop watching the news, stop engaging in social media.
It wasn't just that. He had to say... Yes, I do as well. I should add that my friend also had to stop listening to me, which was a little bit harder for him to admit to. Because post-Grenfell, the kind of stuff we were reading out and hearing was... Well, that was really, really, really sick. And the only...
But opting out for me just simply isn't an option here. And here's the positive you were seeking, James. It's only a small one, I'm afraid.
No, I'll take it.
I'm trying to channel that anger, into my campaigning, and I'd rather than knocking on doors, I've been kind of using my modest social media assets. But another thing I've been doing, and I hope this gets wider discussion, is vote swapping.
Yes.
Am I allowed to give a little plug to a website that enables it?
Yeah, I guess you can. If people want to swap their votes, then Guy's going to provide you with some advice on how you do that without mentioning any constituencies. And for balance, I should stress that if you don't want to swap your vote, then don't.
Then don't, yeah. Well, it's called swapmyvote.org. I've managed to convince my mum to
Careful. I think that's all we need to know. So this is a website that would let you see perhaps how you might get the result, the second best result in any given constituency, as opposed to the first best result, but you'd avoid the worst result. And a lot of people doing that is something that, in many ways, speaks of the mess, doesn't it? Because you're choosing between a rock and a hard place, and someone else comes along and says, well, here's a mildly hard. You'll go for that. But it's all about Brexit for you, Guy. Let's not beat about the bush.
No, it is, absolutely. But I hope by by about the middle of tomorrow, I will have arranged about 25, 30 vote swaps among either complete strangers with my friends or among my kind of friends and
because our first
family.
past the post system is such that everybody recognises that millions of people live in constituencies where their first instinct, their first vote, their first loyalties would involve casting a vote that is rendered ultimately meaningless, for good or for ill, and that applies to everybody. It applies to plenty of people in seats held by all of the major parties, in all of the United Kingdom as well, the nationalist parties as well, in Wales and Scotland. There'll be constituencies where if you don't support the incumbent party, your vote is more or less meaningless. So swap it. 11:37 is the suggestion from Guy. Andrew's in Swansea. Andrew, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Yeah, just I'm going back at conversation, unfortunately, to how you talked about how this morning how Brexit affects individuals and how it's affected me. Yes. One of the things I'm struggling with is almost the hypocrisy of my own views, in that I'm an ardent Remainer.
Well, I knew that, didn't I? The moment you could admit to being hypocritical about something, you go on.
Obviously in that I class myself as liberal and accepting, and that's kind of part of my overall sort of what I thought was my view of the world. But now I find myself walking down the street, someone doing something wrong or whatever, and I can, in my own head, thinking, I bet you voted for Brexit. And do you know what I mean? I'm already being not accepting to others involved, and then I, in the same breath, become part of the problem.
Well, it's funny.
That internal conflict is hard.
And it's often unfair. I mean, if you're basing it on appearances, I'm sure you're not, but as opposed to behaviours and words, the idea that there is a typical Remainer is actually ridiculous. It was one of the biggest and best lies that they managed to inflate in the first place. This talk of metropolitan liberal elites and what have you is
I'm a South Walian tree surgeon. I don't quite fall into the liberal elite.
No, I wonder if Karl Popper can help you with his paradox of tolerance. So a society is tolerant without limit, then it loses its ability to be tolerant, because eventually the intolerant take over. It sounds odd, and Popper puts it better than I do, but basically the idea is that a society must be intolerant of intolerance. So I think you can soothe yourself with the thought that you're not being illiberal, you're being intolerant of intolerance. And of course what your average Brexiter is intolerant of is facts.
But that's thing, but you have to step...
Oh, and foreigners. Facts and foreigners. They can pick one or the other, whichever one they hate the most.
But that frustration with Brexit and that sort of conflict, I feel I have to step away from it. But then I have another conflict in that thinking, well, I stand by the sort of process of bad things happen when good
men do nothing, which makes you sound very like Guy in Battersea. Guy in Battersea, Andrew in Swansea, metropolitan liberal elite, or just some fellas trying to say what they see. I do not know, but I do know that the public figures who are paid by nobody, least of all billionaire newspaper barons, to offer up political opinion or even political guidance probably deserve a little bit more respect than many people offer them. I mentioned earlier that Steve Coogan is among their number, and he is on the line now. Steve, thank you for your time. We are obviously required not to refer specifically to any constituencies or anything like that, but this issue of tactical voting has gathered pace in the last few weeks. Perhaps you could talk us through exactly what it is and why you are endorsing it today.
Yeah, I am. Well, I think this, first of all, this election is unique like no other. And so I think the sort of request that I'm going around with, and a number of other people, is to vote tactically because to get rid of the government. And that just means, quite simply, whatever constituency you're in, whoever the main contender for the incumbent Conservative, if you're in a marginal constituency, if the main contender is Liberal, then vote for the Liberal Democrats, and if the main contender is Labour, then vote for the Labour candidate. And I'd add that I think this is particularly unique because I think it's about something more fundamental than party politics, and indeed many One Nation Conservatives feel the same about this, and have sort of cut themselves loose from their normal party loyalties because they realise what's at stake. It's about sort of way we conduct ourselves, about common decency. And I think that it's not actually just about Brexit. It's about the fact that this particular Conservative administration, I have many friends who are Conservatives, but not the kind of people who would support the current government. This is about a sweep of right-wing populism across Europe. And if you vote for Boris Johnson's government, you are party to that tsunami of intolerant politics based on people's prejudices, people's vulnerabilities, their insecurities, and it's the worst kind of political conduct. There used to be a thing called common decency, and even Conservatives I disagreed with used to adhere to it, and I think that's no longer the case. So there's much more at stake this time round.
Indeed, I hear you. I also need to remind my listeners that you're expressing a deeply held opinion with which many people would take issue. What prompts you or propels you to put that opinion above the parapet, given that I was speaking to Hugh Grant earlier, you're both really enjoying astonishing career success at the moment, and you both have a long history of coming under attack from British newspapers. So in many ways you're both painting targets on your backsides again. Why? Yeah.
Well, first of all, I do feel that I'm uniquely placed in that I feel like I'm at a level now where no one person can bring me down. It would need a concerted effort by a party of people. So it might still be possible, but I can't.
Don't tempt fate, Steve Coogan.
I can't be fired by any individual. And also, it would be easy for me to do nothing and not invite the ire of columnists in the Daily Mail, etc., etc. But I've sort of gotten comfortable with it now. In fact, if I don't get attacked by the Daily Mail from time to time, then I start to worry that I'm doing something wrong. So I see it as a sort of a mark of pride.
You joke, but it does sometimes hurt and cut deep, presumably, and yet here you are sort of calling them out again. The thing is, you can stand and scream at the television, or you can try and do something. And, so I really sort of have no choice. I mean, I was raised to speak my mind and certainly speak up for people I feel are less fortunate. And I feel like this government is utilising ignorance and prejudice against the most vulnerable people in society. And so I feel I have to do something. But I'm fine with being part. If you do, the one thing I would say is that my opinions are deeply held. No one's paying me a salary, as you said. I'm not one of the 5 billionaires who control the newspapers in this country. So I'm not. I'm in no one's pocket. So I don't earn my living from this. I earn my living from writing dramas and trying to be funny from time to time. So, Indeed, and long may that continue. Do you have an overview? I mean, Brexit has perhaps put blinkers on many of us, but some of the stuff you describe, if you're right, is objectively grim. Do you have an overview on how it has come to this, how it has happened?
I think people like simple solutions. Everyone gravitates towards simple solutions. So the dog whistle politics of Boris Johnson's government is about providing simple solutions and anything, a simple message, even if it's wrong or prejudiced, if it's simple, people can grasp it, and that's a danger. So often the people who are more compassionate and have nuanced arguments are on the back foot because nuanced arguments are not simple, whereas prejudicial arguments are very simple, so they're easier to access. So at the moment, saying all our problems will be solved as soon as we leave Europe is a complete nonsense, but it sounds good, so people want to believe it. But it's a lie. It's misinformation. The only sort of positive thing I can take from it is that when there are people who are pushing the politics of the hate mongers, as I call them, there are people of all political persuasions who do tend to put aside their differences when things of great magnitude are at stake. So I find there are people, I have friends in the Conservative Party and Liberal friends, and they understand, I think, what's at stake, and so they're completely empathetic to what many of us are trying to do, which is to vote in a way that you might never have considered before.
you'd go mad, wouldn't you, if people who were historically on the other side of political arguments from you didn't recognise the importance of some of the issues that transcend party political loyalties. That's what you're saying, is that if you were still shouting this from the sidelines and people on the other political platforms were sort of dismissing you and poo-pooing you, you begin to think whether you'd got it wrong. But the fact that there's been this, I mean, seeing former Conservative prime ministers intervene in the debate is unprecedented.
Of course it is, because I think even for the Conservative Party, the party they have at the moment is one they don't recognise. And all those people in the Conservative Party who even people I disagree with politically, but I would acknowledge are men and women of great principle, feel that their party is one that they don't recognise anymore, and that's so. It's just a case. And I think, if there was no overall majority, then it would discredit the current Boris Johnson government, and then the real Conservatives, the ones with integrity, can wrest back their party to what I think they wanted it to be.
Steve Coogan, many thanks indeed. 11:47 is the time. I'll mention some of the Conservative manifesto pledges by way of balance of Steve's contribution, but I would also remind you that it ended with him not actually calling for anyone to win the general election tomorrow. They have promised £2.9 billion more each year to tackle issues. I think you could file them under austerity. They have also promised 31,000 more nurses, new nurses, to help tackle problems faced in the NHS. And that pledge to end the Brexit transition by 2020 is also on the table as well. I'm always happy to insert such information, and you're more than welcome to do so yourself in all the usual ways. 03456060973. There is. I mean, historically, I'd refer to Jim Davidson at this point when you're looking for public figures to balance out public figures making one political point. There will be others, of course there will, but off the top of my head, you've got probably the bloke that owns Wetherspoons. The Bulldog avatars are barking furiously today. When you and your fellow Ramonas lose tomorrow, will you be demanding another election? It's like these people can't count. We had an election in 2017 called by a Prime Minister seeking to deliver Brexit, and now we're having another one in 2019 called by a Prime Minister seeking to deliver Brexit. But you carry on barking at the moon, mate, if it makes you happy, if it keeps you warm at night. You know what question I would ask you if you had the guts to ring in, don't you? What do you think you're going to win? Tumbleweed. What did you win in June of 2016? What did you win? We won the referendum. No, but what did you win? What was the prize? Are we leaving the Europe? Why is that a good thing? Well, it's not a good thing, but we've got to do it because of the will of the people. Thank God for Theo Usherwood. A balm, a soothing balm to oil upon the troubled political waters. Theo, why are you here?
I'm here because I was listening to your interview with Hugh Grant, which was very interesting, and he made a point that people need to be very tactical. This is Hugh Grant's opinion.
Of course it is. And Steve Coogan.
And Steve Coogan's opinion. In specific constituencies, and Hugh Grant's point was that you can only defeat the Conservatives, and that's something that he would like to see in certain constituencies, if you vote tactically, and that of course there are tribal loyalties to whether they be to the Liberal Democrats or Labour or to the Greens, and that people need to put those aside because there will be constituencies where the Liberal Democrats are much better placed to defeat the Conservative candidate, and there'll be other constituencies where the Labour candidate will be in the better position. That people need to put those loyalties that they previously held to one side and vote tactically, and that is the only way, in Hugh Grant's opinion, that Boris Johnson can be kept from returning to number 10 Downing Street. Now, yesterday I was interviewing Robert Buckland. He's the Justice Secretary, and he was making a point about advertising leaflets, literature in this election in certain constituencies that was being put out without what is by law required, which is an imprint about who it's come from and what their address is, and that this literature has been put out to defeat particular Conservative candidates, and and his point was that the number of leaflets being put out are breaching spending limits for non-political parties.
Oh, okay.
Which is at currently £10,000. It's £30,000 in particular constituents for political parties. And his point was that this shouldn't be allowed to happen, and there need to be a review of the law to stop that from happening in the future.
There is an orchestrated campaign going on in some seats, so-called tactical voting, and very negative, unattributed literature going out about Conservative candidates. No imprint on them, no way of working out who's publishing it. This is frankly a little bit sinister. And my advice to everybody is play within the bounds of the law, be respectful, do not use this general election as an excuse to create some sort of agitation in a very negative way. Let's be positive about our campaigns. Yes, have robust criticism of each other, but play within the rules of what the British people would accept is civilised debate.
Do you think, final question, do you think are you levelling that accusation at Labour or the Liberal Democrats or both?
Well, look, when you've got unattributed leaflets, you can't, there's no
evidence. Have you seen them? What's on them?
Yeah, well, I've seen evidence of leaflets, listing things about Conservative candidates that might be construed as negative, clearly negative campaigning against Conservatives as part of a tactical
out of bounds
operation. Well, I mean, I think some of it very much hits the border, and also if you haven't got an imprint on it that is printed and published by, you can't be responsible. There's no accountability for anything that's said. Everything that goes out in my name or the name of any other mainstream political party candidate has to have an imprint on it. Why? Because we need to be held accountable for anything we say in it that might not be accurate. And that's what I'm talking about, is this sort of unattributed, sort of, cloak and dagger, third-party stuff that, none of us can regulate. And I do think after this election we need to just consider again how the rules are policed.
Now, I have asked the Conservative Party for examples of these leaflets. I asked them just over 24 hours ago after that interview with Mr. Buckland, and I haven't received any leaflets back.
They have, with respect, Theo, I know you're a very important person, but they have got quite a lot going on at the moment.
No, I just asked for an example, though.
So the leaflet would be one that is paid for by mysterious sources, but which is agitating against Conservative candidates.
So it's a leaflet where, and I have seen leaflets, but they do have imprints on them.
Yes. I see.
Where you have a leaflet and it says vote a particular Conservative candidate, MP, they might be, standing for re-election, out of office because we need to put somebody progressive
and
they would see
allegation,
Liberal Democrat or Labour in it.
But Buckland's allegation is that there's lots of generics. What's his name? Buckland's allegation is that there's lots of these leaflets around which are not imprinted, so you don't know where they've come from or who's paid for them.
And therefore you don't know whether they are within the spending limits of the person who has paid for them, and therefore they would be a breach of rules governing the election.
And have you seen any?
No.
And he didn't have any with him.
I did ask him. You
wouldn't expect him to have any with him.
But I did ask them for some.
Right. So you never know. Have you checked your inbox? It's only 11:56. Second post.
I'm just.
So that, and the other issue, of course, and I don't know if you've looked at this. I haven't asked you. The astonishing number of adverts online that are genuinely paid for by mysterious sources. The Capitalist Worker was one of them, and they're spending some serious money. But as we learned, much to our shock, a couple of months ago, no laws, no regulation, no requirements. You can pay whatever you want to stick stuff in people's Facebook feeds, whether it's true or not.
Yes.
Whatever party you're from or not from.
No, well, if you can only spend so much in an election, and the cap is at £20 million. But
if I want to set something up to campaign furiously for a party without disclosing where the money's come from, I can.
And you could, but there would be a limit. You'd have to register if you want to spend more than £7,500.
Right.
But you would then you could set up multiple organisations, and then you would be capped at £700,000.
Theo Ashwood, what are you going to do? I mean, a long night. What do you do? Get some kip tonight? Get an early night tonight? And then...
No, I go home usual time, go to bed normal time, then I wake up.
Yeah, that's a relief.
After this election,
you heard it here first, folks.
And then I have the day off, and I have some.
Oh, tomorrow you don't need to do anything.
You can't do any
We'd have to lock the studio door if you tried to get in. What other enthusiasms do you have apart from a state agency?
Well, no, I just have to.
I know you have day off, but if people needed to hear from you, what else would you? Because we only know you as a political correspondent. What other areas of people will want to know now that Theo Ashwood is becoming a celebrity in his own right on LBC? What other? If this was Look In magazine or Smash Hits and it had had hobbies, what would you have there? What else would you?
I haven't had any hobbies.
The public wants to know this. The public wants to know this stuff. It's about building a brand, Theo. So what are your other, apart from politics, what have you got?
I just have my family.
That's nice, yeah. Family man.
That takes up a lot of time.
Did you go down to football? Anything like that? You got a band? Play a bit of bass? Nothing at all?
Just like when?
Tell the listener something that would surprise them.
I like cycling.
You. Cycling?
It's a bit boring, isn't it?
Yes.
I'm trying to teach my little boy to play football.
And he's coming alive now.
He's insistent he wants a pair of football boots with studs.
Fantastic.
So we've been trying to help. I've been trying to,
find some tiny little boots with studs in them.
And he doesn't, because I got him the wrong ones, because then he can play in the playground, but those weren't the right ones.
No, you can't wear studs.
Those are the sorts of things that bother me. But he wants the ones that go on grass like a proper footballer.
Yeah, of course he does.
That's it.
Lovely sad. Nothing. Don't play video games or keep tropical fish.
No.
Campanology, stamp collecting, philately.
Really boring at the moment.
No, you're not boring.
I'll get my life back. 2020 will be different.
I'm giving you advice.
2020 will be different.
From an X-list celebrity to a Z-list celebrity, I'm trying to teach you the things that you need in order to cultivate a bit of a. We'll just have to wait for your book, won't we? Life According to Theo Osherwood, hitting all good bookshops by the end of 2027. It's 12 noon. I'm minded to continue for another hour. Do you want to stick around a bit? Why not? Because we can't talk about politics tomorrow. We lock Theo Osherwood in a box until Friday morning, and then he puts in the mother of all shifts. But this election, it's just a strange one, right?